Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's conversation series where we focus on the most important issues related to the transatlantic relationship today. I'm Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And today I am thrilled to welcome to the Atlantic Debrief series Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar, who is the executive director of the Observer Research Foundation's America office, which he helped establish back in 2020. Dhruva is also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Australia, and he writes a regular column for the Hindustan Times. He has a vast background of research on India's relationship with the United States, Japan, Europe, and more, technology, development. He's been published in several books, policy reports, and major publications like Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. So Dhruva, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule today to join us for the Atlantic Debrief.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So today we're obviously talking about all things India. India has had a huge year. They have the rotating G20 presidency. And I know both of us were in New Delhi in March, where the G20 foreign ministers meeting overlapped with the Raisina dialogue hosted, obviously by the Observer Research Foundation. And it seems like everyone was either in India or talking about India. It's in a fascinating spot. It's an important partner to both the US and Europe. It's on its way to overpassing China as the world's most populous country, has a long, complicated relationship with Russia. And according to a recent op-ed in Foreign Policy magazine, there's this really interesting quote where the author says, India hopes to present itself as a bridge power that seeks a new deal for the global South. So I want to start by asking you, we're in this new era of great power competition, as everyone knows and talks about. How does India view itself, and what role does it see itself playing?
So I think a few ways. It's a good question. So one is, I think, India sees itself as a rising power. Its economy is growing, roughly 5.5% on a bad year to 6.5% per year. Its contribution to global growth has been the third since the turn of the millennium, after China and the United States. Roughly amongst if you just take the G20 economies, in 1992, India had about 1% of the total economy, combined economies of the G20. Today it's about 5%, and it's set to grow even further. So I think one is it sees itself as a rising power. Second, it sees, I think, its biggest challenge to its ambitions today is China. Quite clearly. And, China has grown faster than India over this period. It is today playing a global role, but in many ways it's playing a role that is actually inhibiting India's rise. And this includes on the bilateral border conflict, on economic issues, on regional security, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and on issues of global governance and institutional representation. So I think given with those two sort of realities in mind, I think for India, it's about positioning itself relative to three kind of major sets of countries. One is the West, and I think we've seen if anything, we've seen a great deepening of India's cooperative relationships with the United States, with Europe, with Japan, with the G7 countries, essentially, and then the European Union. And this has only accelerated over the past few years. The second is with what are sort of traditional rising powers. These are the BRICS countries. India is actually hosting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting this year, which includes China, Russia, Central Asia. And there are significant differences, obviously, between China and India, but India still sees a need to engage with this grouping of countries, which sometimes for many in the West is seen as very inimical. And finally, I think, to the subject of today's conversation, India sees itself very much as a country of the global South, that is a developing country, a post-colonial country, with which, and therefore it shares both the experience, the lived experience, but also some of the same challenges that countries in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia also experience.
So kind of broadening that a little bit to focus on the transatlantic relationship specifically, the U.S.-European relationship. Obviously, China is a big focus for the U.S. I always say that if there's one thing that is uniting the Democrats and Republicans on foreign policy right now, it's this China hawkishness that's overtaken Washington in many ways. But you're right, where I think India sees China as a great challenge as well. And so how should the US European partners be thinking about sort of bringing India into that conversation? And how should they be thinking about sort of their cooperation with India more broadly?
Mhm. So I think, in the US, I think it's more advanced. There's a great convergence, and I think the Biden administration, when they came in 2 years ago, was quite surprised about the degree of convergence relative to 4 years previously with India on China. That there was a very similar worldview in terms of what they see as the primary challenges, what aspects of China's actions and behavior are deemed sort of as undermining regional security and regional interests and upsetting the balance of power. And we see the Quad in particular emerge as a consequence of that. The US and India working together with Japan and Australia on a whole range of, they have over 20 dialogues and initiatives on a variety of issues, some of which relate to security, some of which relate to the future of economic security, economic sustainability, climate change, public health, you name it. Now, with Europe, it gets a bit more difficult because I think where there is a difference with India is India sees Russia as part of the matrix, right? So for if the challenge for India is China, having a constructive relationship with Russia is, or trying to have that constructive relationship, it's not always successful, is part of that, maintaining that balance of power. And this comes up against another, it sort of contradicts another big flashpoint, a big point of friction, which is obviously between Europe and the United States. It's the transatlantic allies, and Russia, and which is sort of played out in Ukraine. So that is, I think, a much more tricky relationship, and that conversation between Europeans and Indians, I think, needs to be had much more frankly. We have seen a little bit of that over the past year.
I thought it was really interesting. I'm sure you were in the room for this as well during the Ricina dialogue in March, where Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had a conversation with I think the chairman of the Observer Research Foundation. And I thought it was really fascinating because you had this audience. It was a very mixed audience, people from the Global South, people from Europe, people from the US. And if you read a lot of the commentary that came out of that interview for Lavrov, which I believe was his first major sort of public speech since the Russian invasion, if you were reading Western publications, you got this sense that he was basically being jeered for an hour and the conversation and his remarks didn't land well. But if you were in the room, you also saw that there were a lot of cheers and a lot of people agreeing with a lot of the things that he was saying. And, I think since the Russian invasion last year, there's been a lot of conversation about, what is the role that India plays here? What should it not lessen its relationship with Russia, but fundamentally change its relationship with Russia to play a greater role in helping solve this problem? Where do you think India sees itself specifically when it comes to Ukraine, either now and going forward?
Well, I think there are equities. Actually, just today, this morning, Xi Jinping actually spoke to President Zelensky. But I think India sees itself as different. I see a lot of commentary that sort of conflates China's position on the Ukraine conflict and India's position, and I think they're actually quite different in many respects. But a few points. So one is, I think India has a relationship with Russia. The key elements of that are a defense relationship, which is very long-standing and on which India continues to remain very dependent for its national security. A second is sort of an energy and food security relationship that actually was not very strong before the war, but the consequences of the Ukraine war after February of last year have made it much more relevant for India. So, energy, oil imports specifically from Russia to India have increased, partly because of the global shortage of or inadequacy of oil production globally. But this is, again, that's mostly driven by commercial considerations. A third factor, as I mentioned earlier, is like the strategic picture, which is India sees continued engagement with Russia as critical for the broader balance of power, particularly in Eurasia. At the same time, India has sort of continued to engage with Ukraine. I think it's quite revealing that there were more Indian students in Ukraine when the war broke out than there were Indian students in Russia. But India has provided some medical assistance to Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi has spoken to President Zelensky on a number of occasions, including, I believe, last December most recently. So there has been that continued engagement. Ukraine's deputy foreign minister was actually in Delhi just a couple of weeks ago. That is, I think, where things stand there. But Lavrov's engagement was kind of a microcosm, of some larger issues. So one was a lot of Western participants at the Rising Dialogue actually boycotted that session, and in some ways have left the field open for people who were actually more sympathetic to Russia's position, which I think it has some lessons in and of itself. So the other thing is I think there was a lot of emphasis on why he was given a platform like that. But it's interesting that the keynote speaker at the Rising Dialogue this year was the Italian Prime Minister. And, Secretary Blinken spoke, and many European foreign defense ministers, military chiefs spoke at the same dialogue. So that's there. The third is I think just sort of I think what we've discussed before also is that sort of engagement with not just Indian audiences but others from the global South who may be more sympathetic to Russia's positions on a few issues, whether or not those are legitimate. And I think that is really where I think there are lessons to be learned, particularly I think frankly for many Europeans outside of government. I think there a lot more could be done to listen to voices from there.
I think you're right, and I think this sort of segues nicely into my next question. One of the main frameworks of Biden's foreign policy has been this broader existential struggle, right, between democracies and autocracies. And that doesn't seem to resonate with a lot of countries. It sort of puts them, I think, in positions that they don't want to be in. No one wants to be caught in between a great power struggle between the West and Russia and the West and China. I also think that framing, there was this article in Foreign Affairs recently, I can't remember who the author was, but it talks about how this framing really does allow countries in the global South to point out the hypocrisy of how the U.S. conducts its foreign policy in many ways. And I thought that was a really interesting point. But on the other side of that, you hear leaders in both the U.S. and Europe talk about how they have to deepen engagement with the global South. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that India sees itself as a country of the global South. So how do you think that engagement, A, has been going, and B, maybe needs to change as we look into the future?
Right. So this democracy versus autocracy framing is something I'm told that President Biden himself feels very strongly about. And when the White House was drafting the national security strategy, that his personal preference on that framing actually played a role. And also, his supporters in the White House will point to things like the Summit for Democracies, where they will say, over 100 countries participated at very senior levels, and that there is value in sort of improving dialogue amongst democracies. Where it gets complicated, I think, is the reality, right? So all foreign policy in some ways is it requires balancing or taking into account both values and interests. And the reality is in each situation, in each country, in each region, those factors will need to weigh against each other. And by the way, not just for the United States, for Europe, for India, right? So there are sometimes unsavory regimes with which the United States does business, and which are clearly not democracies, but which you have monarchies in the Gulf. You have countries like Vietnam, which is a single-party state, and the U.S. Doesn't have the same qualms about working closely with those countries. So I think that again, these trade-offs will always need to take place. Like for India, for example, there has been a dilemma over the past few years over Myanmar, which is you have a military junta there. On the one hand, you don't want to politically legitimize that military junta. On the other hand, India, for a variety of reasons, from the pandemic to cross-border refugees to counterterrorism objectives to strategic objectives, has to engage with whoever is in power there. So I think that these are the kind of dilemmas that will take place. But for many countries, I think the one is sort of the having to make choices. And in an ideal world for them, those choices would not have to be made. You would have the best. Let me give the example of Southeast Asia. For many years, Southeast Asia has become accustomed to a situation where the U.S. helped to underwrite their broader regional security, including maritime security, while continuing to encourage them to engage with mainland China in economic and trade terms. And this, from their point of view, was the best of all possible possibilities. You derive the economic benefits of engagement with this large growing economy in China, while not having to invest in some of the military resources, expensive, costly military resources that the United States was essentially helping to provide. So that that understanding is coming to an end, and that's making a lot of countries very deeply uncomfortable for understandable reasons. I'd say the final element is for many countries also this idea, this framing of democracy versus autocracies. And again, I think in some ways the U.S. is more evangelical in the rhetoric, but Europe is in fact more exacting in terms of its demands on countries. Get into what are considered sort of very deeply sovereign issues, domestic issues. So, for example, when Europe says, "Okay, we want to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and here are some, here's some, we're providing sort of finance for that and technology for that." But you have to abide by these labor standards and these environmental standards, and have a certain number of women on the board of this new initiative. These are very onerous requirements, and in some ways it becomes much more attractive for the recipient country to say, "Look, there are plenty of alternatives. We don't just have to come to you. We'll seek alternatives which are easier to work with."
Yeah, I know. I've had this conversation with a lot of people as we've looked at 2.5 years, 3 years of the Biden administration at this point. I guess 2.5 years. And it just seems as though this framing, while I understand the drive behind it and the point behind it, it doesn't seem to match up with the desire to outcompete Russia and China, especially in the global South. And I'm not saying that we should lessen our discussion about, say, human rights or the importance of representation and those things, but it does seem like it sort of goes head to head with these requirements that are much less onerous when you look at partners like Russia and China, when you compare them to, say, the United States and Europe. So I don't know that those two goals can go hand in hand.
Yeah. I would just say add one element I think to take into account, which is I think a lot of it is also driven by domestic politics in the United States, and I think that was really a consideration coming in. You see this in the rhetoric already as President Biden now launches a re-election campaign, and part of it is about campaigning in poetry and governing in prose. President Biden said all sorts of things about Saudi Arabia when he was a candidate, but after coming to power has had to work with MBS and the Saudi government on a variety of issues. So I think that's just again some of the realities of domestic politics coming into conflict or complicating strategic prerogatives.
Yeah, you're right about the campaign in poetry, govern in prose. It's a good note to end on. So Dhruva, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule today. This was super fascinating. I always really like talking about India and its role in both the world, but also with the transatlantic partners. So hope to have another conversation like this, perhaps as India ends its G20 presidency and we can look back on it and see some of its accomplishments. So again, thank you. And we hope to see you and have a conversation again with you soon.
Thank you.